and welcome to this episode of the Psyched podcast. I'm your host, Kaya Roman, and I am so psyched today to have Amy Reichelt with me. I am such a fan of this woman, super fangirl over here. Let me tell you about Amy. Dr. Amy Reichelt is the director of Neuropharmacology. In other words, she's super smart at Cybin, where she works across discovery, preclinical, and clinical teams with the aim to develop psychedelic-based therapeutics for mental health conditions. Dr. Reichelt also serves as a member of the board of directors at the Women in Psychedelics Network. She holds a PhD in neuroscience and has led academic research programs in cognitive neuroscience, nutrition, neurobiology, and behavioral pharmacology at top universities. In addition, Amy has authored over 60 peer-reviewed articles in top-tier journals, spoken on dozens of stages, including TEDx Sydney and Microdose Wonderland, and appeared as a scientific expert in TV productions such as ABC's The Science of Drugs. So thank you, Amy. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and to share your expertise with our listeners. We're
Great
really
to be here.
really honored to have this conversation with you. So I want to start off with something super basic. You are leading clinical trials at Cybin, and I think we all hear the term clinical trials, thrown around a lot, and we're looking at interesting clinical trial data. And it's such an exciting time in this emerging industry that this research is happening. But can you just start with like the super basics of what is a clinical trial? I might be the only person that has this question, but I'm hoping there's some other listeners out there that just want to start with the basics. Like, what is a clinical trial? How do you set it up? How do you run it?
Okay, so there's a lot that goes into running a clinical
I can
trial, and it
imagine.
takes an absolute village of people to stand it up. So, at Cybin, where I am currently, we have a whole team of multiple really well qualified and experienced professionals who we're all working together to be able to stand up these clinical trials,
Mm,
and it actually it's a whole process.
okay.
So whereas in Cybin we've got new drugs, so these are
Okay.
investigational new drugs, and so these haven't been tested in people before, but they're all
Right.
derived from our classical psychedelics that we think about psilocybin or DMT. So we have these two programs, but at Cybin we're making these drugs better by tweaking them molecularly at this sort
Okay.
of very chemistry basis, but this makes them new products.
Mm-hmm.
So in our current, where we're working, my program that I'm involved in is our deuterated DMT trial.
Okay.
So at the moment we are standing up our investigational package, where we've gone through preclinical. So we've tested this for toxicology, we've tested it for how like the dosing is in animals, but then
Okay.
we've got to make a big package, and then we submit that to our health authority of where we're going to run the clinical trial, be it in the UK or in Canada, North America, Australia, anywhere. They've all got
Mm-hmm.
their health authorities. This then package either gets approved or not approved. I mean, we're hoping for it to be approved, um, based on like our excellent preclinical work so far. We
Right.
know that these are effective and safe medicines from the studies that have been conducted academically and in the past using psilocybin, for example. But yeah, then we have to basically set up the clinical trial, which involves identification of where we want to run the trial, who we want to run the trial with geographically, whether or not we're going to do it across multiple countries, cities, and we work with clinical research organizations and partners who help with the recruitment and the site management. But really, I mean, it is, yeah, it's a massive team effort of
Mm-hmm.
individuals all working together to get this clinical trial, which is in multiple phases as well. So we start off with our phase one
Wow.
clinical trial, which is our first in human.
Okay.
That's with healthy volunteers who volunteer to take the drug, and they're tested. They have lots of blood tests to be able to
Hmm.
see whether the drug, how their body is responding to it, how they are able to metabolize and clear the drug from the system. And then if
Hmm.
it's deemed to be safe, then it moves into phase two clinical trials, which is where you start addressing the indication of the mental health condition that we want to look at. So
Okay.
in Cybin, which is our deuterated psilocybin analog, that's major depressive disorder. And in our Cyb4 program, that's going to be anxiety disorders.
Got it.
So, yeah, and then we start to be able to compare how efficacious the drug is over time to see how durable it is, and
Hmm.
then move on then hopefully to phase 3 and then into phase 4. So, I mean, these are the
Wow.
future. So,
A lot of
um,
phases.
at the moment, we're really focusing around the phase in 1 and 2 trials, getting the first
Hmm.
studies done, getting the phase 2 trials sort of organized with our indications. But yeah,
Hmm.
it's a mammoth effort.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I really thank you on behalf of, so many of us in the industry for doing this work because really it's the clinical trials that prove that these medicines work. It's the clinical trials that will move the legislation forward to change the availability of these medicines, right? So
Yeah,
I'm guessing that's why these clinical trials are so essential. But
yeah.
are there any other reasons why you need to do clinical trials? I mean, other than to prove that they work.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's to allow the access to the
Hmm.
individuals who need them the most. We need these clinical trials to allow people to access the drugs through their physicians effectively.
Hmm.
We need
Right.
to show the medical community that these are safe and tolerable and effective. And that's what
Hmm.
we need to, wrap up into the package. And that then will allow the health insurance companies to say, okay, this is a
Mm.
feasible and useful use of money that in health funding, that
Right.
this is why it's needed.
That's so
Ho-
key.
Getting these things basically prescribed by physicians. So
Yeah.
instead of going to your family doctor and saying, I've been on antidepressants for years, I am not happy with the side effects or how they're
Hmm.
making me feel, is there another option? And hopefully then your GP or your psychiatrist or whoever's your mental health provider is going to be able to
Hmm.
say, I'm going to recommend you do a course of psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, or our Cyb3 assisted psychotherapy.
Right.
And yeah, it's really getting these two people in this really healthcare setting and getting them accepted as an actual therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I'm so glad you brought up the health insurance point because, at least in this country, the United States, that's just so important for moving the medicine forward is that we have to be able to have it covered by health insurance. So I'm curious, you have obviously a background in neuroscience um, and neuropharmacology. So, you mentioned that other people on other like antidepressants or other medications that maybe aren't working. Do you see a lot of potential in these psychedelic medicines to treat mental health disorders that just haven't, other things haven't been working? Why is that exciting to you?
I think it's really, really exciting because, I mean, currently there hasn't been any kind of shakeup of drugs for mental health disorders like depression and anxiety. It's
Mhm.
all been, since the 90s when there was fluoxetine, which is Prozac,
Mhm.
and there hasn't been a new form of antidepressants since then. Really, they're what we call Me Too drugs. So it might just be like you go from your citalopram to your escitalopram and your fluoxetine, and they're basically all the same because they just work as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Mhm.
And there hasn't really been a shakeup in the field. And what we know is that these antidepressants don't work for everyone. There's
Mhm.
about 30% of individuals, they don't work at all. The
Mhm.
side effects of long-term antidepressant use, or even short-term antidepressant use, are, are pretty stark as well. Like there's, people start to just feel really emotionally blunted and numb, and there's all the
Mhm.
sexual side effects, and
Mm.
just, changes in your appetite, changes in your sleep. And, that's not really a way for people to live long term.
Right.
And I've always just felt as well that antidepressants are so overprescribed in the like first instance when we actually know that behavioral therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychotherapy is usually as effective as an antidepressant,
Mhm.
but it's not one of those things that doctors are necessarily willing to prescribe to somebody. People go
Right.
to see their clinical psych usually because they have health insurance that covers it. And
Mhm.
it's much easier just to put somebody on a drug for a
Right.
long period of time. And yeah, I just think that, you shouldn't have to do that. It's, you've got to be able to address the root cause a bit more of why people are experiencing, depression and anxiety.
Mhm.
And I think that the way that psychedelics are actually working, it's, they're still affecting the serotonin system,
Mhm.
but they're in a different way. It's almost like laser focus to the
Mm.
frontal cortex, and this is where we see biological changes when conducting our preclinical experiments, and academic experiments have also shown that these drugs are actually structurally changing the neurons in the prefrontal cortex, which is the area that's involved in decision making and emotional regulation, and their effects are really rapid. So
Wow.
you're not having to wait like 2 to 4 weeks for, to feel a bit better because you started taking antidepressants. It's, these effects are rapid, and they also, from the clinical trials, appear to be very much sustained, and that is
It's
supported.
exciting.
Yeah, and it's supported by, the clinical trials, for instance, like the COMPASS trials with psilocybin, their COMP360. They're showing, effects up to, like, 3 months, and this is just, like, with a single treatment or 2 treatments. I
That's
mean, this is what's
amazing.
really exciting. So, they're actually, a lot more potent and
Mm.
effective, potentially, than our antidepressants, our classical, SSRIs.
Well, didn't a big study come out recently saying that, the whole premise of SSRIs might be misdirected anyway, that serotonin receptors might not even be the main factor in depression?
Yeah, I'm a bit on the fence about that one. I felt like that
Sure.
paper was quite provocative in terms of what it was saying by
Definitely
being
provocative.
the
Definitely clickbait.
serotonin. The serotonin hypothesis doesn't mean
Yes.
anything. There is literature to support that, that serotonin changes
Mhm.
affect mood. And then there was a study that came out very recently as well that used positron emission tomography, so PET scans of brain, and that was conducted, and they did see changes in serotonin in individuals who are experiencing a major depressive episode compared to healthy controls.
Hmm.
So
Got it. Those kinds of studies are so important.
yeah, so that was obviously countering what
Right.
the study that was saying about, there are no changes.
Yeah.
It's difficult. I think that if there's any kind of neurotransmitter modulation in the brain, so any kind of change, it usually has some sort of behavioral knock-on effect. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to be said for, how antidepressants do help individuals with mental health conditions,
Hmm.
depression. I think that we still don't really know what
Right.
the effect is. I mean, one of the interesting uh, facts about SSRIs is that they actually increase BDNF gradually, and they can
Hmm.
start to also increase neurogenesis in areas of the brain. So, but it takes time for that to kick in. But potentially that might be underpinning some of their therapeutic effects in terms of mental health conditions.
Hmm.
So,
Well, it's
yeah,
interesting because that's what psychedelics do, right? But
yeah.
without the horrible side effects.
Without having to take them for 6 months straight to see any.
Yeah. Yeah. And losing your libido and feeling like a zombie.
Yeah,
Um,
everything feels very beige right now.
yeah. So, with your clinical trials and, just figuring out, first of all, do these work? Is there an aspect of it of figuring out why they work?
Oh, yes, there is that.
And
I
so
mean,
how
I
do you
think
do that? I mean, like how do you figure out what is going on in the brain that makes these things work?
yeah, I mean, there's so many different sorts of experimental modalities that are being used to really study how these drugs, well, psychedelics, are affecting the brain. And I think it's incredibly fascinating. There's just like new papers coming out like every day, every week.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
it's
so hard to keep on
amazing.
top.
It used to be like once a year it would be so exciting. Oh, something came out about psychedelics. And now, like,
I'm
you're
just like,
right, it's almost every
oh,
day.
another one. But what's really interesting is that there's studies that have been conducted in laboratory animals, so using rats and mice,
Okay.
and that's actually allowing you to look at how these drugs are affecting like molecules like in the
Mhm.
brain. So how they're changing gene expression to increase certain like neurotrophic factors like BDNF,
Okay.
see that they increase. That's brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
I was just gonna ask you to tell us what that is. Okay,
Read
and what
the
and what
place.
does that mean?
So brain-derived neurotrophic factor is one of it's basically endogenously produced in the brain, and it helps your neurons to connect together and grow new branches and
Okay, this is a good
um,
thing.
yeah, yeah.
Very good thing.
We like
We like
neurons
we
to
like
be.
BDNF.
Yeah, BDNF is good. But also there's studies that look at, say, how the actual neurons are changed structurally. So
Okay.
they're really fascinating as well because
Wow.
you can, yeah, with new technologies, you could actually have these little tiny microscopes that you can fit onto your mice brains effectively and image the same bit over and over when these animals have had psychedelic treatments, and they can show that there's like branching of the neurons and new synapses, so there's the little connections between the neurons being formed in real time effectively. That's like absolutely like next level
Wow.
amazing. And then also
Totally.
there's all the studies that have been done with neuroimaging with people. So
Okay.
yeah, taking it back to our humans, particularly in clinical trials, that we're able to use, say, functional MRI to look at um, like brain hemodynamics. So that's as a proxy for brain activity. So changes in blood flow in the brain. You can use EEG to look at electrical activity in the brain, or MEG, and and then there's PET scans as well. As I was saying with the serotonin, you can actually have a PET tracer that is specific to a sort of, how glucose is uptake in the brain or synapse formation, and it's all very exciting and interesting.
Yeah.
um, but it's really like this forefront of not just understanding how these drugs are affecting the brain, but I mean, as neuroscientists, allowing us to understand more about the brain in general, because
Hmm.
these drugs have taught people about, consciousness even. So, what happens dynamically within the brain when you're, before you take the drug and during a trip, which is so cool to find out, how your brain waves change when you're taking these drugs, like what's actually going on in your brain, and
Ooh, can
seeing
you tell us a little bit more about that? What is going on? I've heard
well,
that you go into theta waves typically, but can you tell us a little bit more?
yeah, so you actually see a kind of drop in alpha and a shift towards from high frequency oscillations to lower frequency
Mm-hmm.
oscillations. So that's pretty interesting, to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
just being able to sort of
In
map
other
out.
words, the brain relaxes.
Yeah, yeah, to an extent, and that's also been shown with the neuroimaging fMRI studies as well, is that your brain goes into this sort of like entropic state, and
Mm-hmm.
it that's like Robin Carhart Harris's work, where he talks about rebus, which is the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, and that basically your brain is actually changing and continues to change after the fact, and that allows you to integrate in these new thought patterns in a way.
And do all the psychedelic compounds seem to have this aspect in common? I mean, whether it's DMT or psilocybin or, these synthetic compounds that you're looking at, uh, do they all pretty much do the same thing?
Yeah, because when we think about our tryptamine drugs, our tryptamine psychedelics, they're all affecting the 5-HT2A receptor. And also, when we think about like ergolines and like LSD and phenethylamines, so there's like 2CB compounds,
Mm-hmm.
they also affect the 5-HT2A receptor. So they act to activate it. So they're called agonists.
Okay.
But this is thought to, change effectively widespread brain changes, and how, you get these alterations in consciousness, and the visual type hallucinations or auditory hallucinations, and then it's all very much part of how the brain is reacting to the
Mm.
activation of these receptors in the cortex.
Wow, so fascinating. So you're saying the word consciousness, and this is a word that I would typically hear from somebody in the more spiritual realm, but as a neuroscientist, what do you mean when you say the word consciousness?
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, obviously understanding how the brain functions is really a next level of, neuroscience we don't understand fully, in terms of like consciousness,
Yeah,
well, how this is generated in the
right,
brain. And
right.
I tend to think that, it's that sense of self,
Mhm.
and, sense of knowing about your environment and your interactions, and being aware of what's going on, and that these psychedelic drugs are able to evoke profound shifts in terms of your consciousness that may be reflected by the changes that are observed in neuroimaging studies, but still we don't really understand what's
Right.
happening, and it's just a next frontier really in understanding. I mean, that that every time you pinpoint something, you're like, oh, there's a theory, or there's a observation that supports something. Just it opens like another like 10 doors of, of trying to understand other things. So I think that when we think about consciousness, we think about it on a more simplified level,
Okay.
but there's a lot.
So much room for
There's a lot.
discovery. It's a good
Yeah.
time to be a neuroscientist studying psychedelic medicine, I guess.
Yeah,
Endless
nobody's got the
opportunities
brain
for
yet.
research. Yeah, I mean, it's such an exciting field and it seems like it's really just at the beginning. What is getting you like most excited? I mean, I'm guessing everything that we're talking about is pretty exciting to you, but is there anything in particular that you're like really, really excited about in this psychedelic drug development field at the moment?
I'm really interested in neuroplasticity. It's kind of been my
Mm,
jam for a while.
me
I think
too.
that
It's
neuroplasticity is
my
kind of cool.
favorite topic.
um, but yeah, I've been really excited about how these psychedelic drugs are able to, increase plasticity in the brain,
Hmm.
and that's not just at the sort of the molecular level, looking at the cellular changes and then understanding how that then relates to behavior and provides interesting ways of thinking of how these drugs can treat not just depression and anxiety or these psychiatric type disorders, but moving into more neurological disorders as well, where we
Oh.
understand that neuroplasticity is diminished and that could potentially be underpinning things like dementia and mild cognitive
Mhm.
impairment through to Alzheimer's disease. But I think that neurological disorders, again, there's very few drugs that have been actually successful in treating them. When we think
Right.
about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, there's
Yeah.
nothing still.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And at this point, probably all of us know someone who's been affected by it. All of our families, it's increasing. And like you
yeah,
said, there's no treatment. So that is extremely exciting if these compounds can help to repair the brain and
yeah,
focus on neuroplasticity in a way that can affect these neurological conditions. That's super
yeah.
exciting.
And moving from just from like aging disorders when we think about dementia, but also for individuals who've experienced traumatic brain injuries, so
Mm,
concussions, and people are experiencing you know post concussive syndrome, and
right.
having then you know, understanding more about how potentially healthy aging of the brain as well. So when individuals start to experience brain fog, what can be done? And currently there's
Hmm.
nothing. It's like
Right.
just maybe go for a run or like eat better. And
Yeah.
it's people need more than that if
Yeah.
they're experiencing these like very pathological changes to their cognitive abilities.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. So much research to be done and so much to be excited about, like what's coming in the future. Another thing that I know you have worked on in the past is like the connection between diet and cognitive function. And I'm curious how your previous research now is translating into some of the things you're looking into with psychedelics for potentially the treatment of eating disorders or obesity. Is there a connection there?
Yeah, I've been really excited about this as well
Hmm.
because I mean, my previous research was around how poor diet, so our modern junk food laden diet that so many people do consume, actually changes cognition in the brain. It changes
Right.
memory, someone's ability to form new memories, and it alters how you can control your behavior as well. And that then stems into sort of ideas around how there's eating addiction and food addiction, and that people
Hmm.
become sort of dependent on certain types of food, and binge eating disorder and anorexia have these very much behavioral components that align to compulsive type behaviors, and also have this behavioral habit driven, that's addiction like,
Mm.
and we know that
Right.
psychedelics are really good at helping people beat addiction as well.
Amazing.
So there's the MAPS trial with MDMA for anorexia nervosa and also binge eating disorder. There's a psilocybin trial being underway at Imperial College for, again, anorexia. But then thinking about also obesity, the
Hmm.
obesity itself sets up a low level of inflammation throughout the body. So our adipocytes, our fat cells, effectively start to release these cytokines that are, little chemicals that get in your bloodstream, and they're going around, they get into your brain, and in your brain they start to also evoke levels of neuroinflammation that can start to change your abilities in terms of memory formation and executive control.
Hmm.
And we know that our psychedelic drugs have, 5-HT2A agonists are also potentially anti-inflammatory. So there's work
That's
by
amazing.
Charles Nichols' lab that showed that um, DOI, which is another sort of prototypical tryptamine,
Hmm.
uh, that that was able to reduce inflammation in a number of organs in the
Wow.
body. So when they administered mice things that make them inflamed, or even with a study where they gave mice a Western diet, so again, fed it these high fat, high sugar foods to the mice, the DOI was able to reduce markers of inflammation.
Wow.
So, so,
A lot of people would be excited about that.
but
Eat what you
it,
want, reduce the inflammation anyway.
no, it's all about changing your behavior, so you
Yes.
don't want to eat those things
Okay,
anymore.
good.
But also, I think that we know that obesity and poor diet does, predispose certain um, neurological changes in the brain that are similar to sort of dementia. So it do
Mm,
they reduce your BDNF. They they
right.
cause, your synapses in certain brain regions, your neurons start to lose their synapses because
Oh,
of
wow.
the high fat diet that's being consumed. And I mean, this is in again sort of laboratory studies, but at the same time, it is really concerning that
Yeah.
if people are eating these poor foods and have really built these kind of behavioral habits around
Mhm.
the consumption of these foods,
Right.
they
And
also
it becomes an addiction as
yeah,
well.
these foods hijack, or effectively they're affecting the brain's reward system in the same
Mm,
way that it is hijacked by drugs of abuse that make you want more of them. So, you're there and you're like, "Oh man, this cake is amazing," and then you just want more of the cake,
yes. Oh
and
my gosh. I'm sure everyone listening can relate.
because you know that it tastes good and you know that it feels good to eat, but
Mhm.
effectively they do change how you appraise, other foods. Like you'd be like, "Do
Right.
you want a cake or do you want a salad?" It was like,
Mhm.
feeling the cake right now. Um, so it's just our brain hasn't really evolved past being, our cavemen life where we were survivors and we were hunter gatherers, and those high energy foods were so rewarding
Right.
because they were scarce. I mean, most of what we eat most of the time when we're cavemen, cave people, sorry, we'd be eating twigs and berries and occasionally you might get some, meat with fat, and that's your high density energy source, so that your brain is naturally hardwired towards wanting those kind of high energy food sources. So
Wow.
yeah.
This is so exciting, and this has just been so fascinating, Amy. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me and just let all of our listeners know all of the potential that, we're literally just scratching the surface on for these incredible psychedelic medicines. So I'm sure we're leaving people wanting to know more. Where can people find you and follow along with your work?
Well, you can follow along with Cybin with their drug development. I also have a website which is amyreichelt.com, which is just my personal website. I also worked as a nutritionist, and I have a website which is cognitionnutrition.ca, and that will allow you to find me through various platforms. Uh,
Wonderful.
yeah, so it's I can be Googled.
Okay, excellent. And definitely I'm sure you recommend and I recommend as well to follow along with Cybin's, really exciting work to bring these medicines forward and discover what's happening in the brain, discover what's possible. I mean, I've learned a lot, like with inflammation, how many conditions are related to inflammation? Like
Yeah.
that's a huge, huge field beyond mental health, even, which is what we usually talk about with psychedelics. So I'm super excited, as if I could be even more excited about this field. I'm even more excited after talking with you. So thank you again, Amy. And I look forward to following along with your work.
Thank you so much for having me.